Director of Marketing and Program Development for the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. We welcome you to Book Sandwiched In. We ask that you please silence your cell phones at this time. Our thanks go to those who help fund programs like these through FFRPL, the dedicated FFRPL committee members who curate and organize these events, our guest speakers who so graciously share their time and talents with us, the library staff who help with our setup and production, and the thousands of people who attend each year, in person and online. At each BSI review, we convey these thanks. Today, we'd be remiss if we didn't recognize the recent passing of Sanford Shapiro, who was so dedicated to this series. Sandy served on the FFRPL board, he served on the BSI committee for many, many years, and he often presented BSI reviews as well. We are grateful for his long-standing service to FFRPL and the library, and we extend our condolences to Sandy's family. He will be missed. We are live streaming the formal portion of today's program to the library's YouTube channel at Rochester Public Library, New York. If you need to access the induction loop service in the auditorium, please adjust your hearing aid to the T switch. FFRPL raises funds, presents programs, supports special projects, helps to create specialized spaces, and purchases supplemental materials and equipment for the Rochester Public Library. We also manage restricted funds that provide supplemental materials support to 62 eligible libraries in Monroe, Ontario, Wayne, Livingston, Orleans, and Genesee counties. We raise funds through our annual campaign, capital campaigns, grants, planned gifts, and revenue from book sales on-site and online. We present programs like today's Book Sandwiched In review. We support special projects like RPL's online author talks presented in partnership with the Library Speakers Consortium. You can visit rockcitylibrary.org to register for the online talk with Nobel Peace Prize laureate Malala Yousafzai tomorrow, Wednesday, October 22nd at 7 p.m. I did mispronounce her name. FFRPL purchases supplemental materials and equipment for the library like the laptops for the new mobile library, RPL Go. And finally, FFRPL helps to create specialized spaces, including the Maplewood Community Library renovation project, which we will support through our Rock the Day campaign on December 2nd. We thank our donors who make all of our work possible. Today, Tyler Barton will review Bibliophobia, a memoir by Sarah Chihawa. Utilizing titles such as Anne of Green Gables, Possession, A Tale for the Time Being, and The Last Samurai as personal manuals, Chihawa explores her childhood, racial and cultural identity, experiences with, quote, harmful practices of survival, quote, and depression, as well as the myriad ways books can influence readers who become obsessed with them. Yi-Yun Lee, author of The Book of Goose, says, quote, reading Bibliophobia is like having a deep and intimate conversation with a kindred lover of literature. The world may not become better, but in this conversation, we each become less isolated and lonely, close quote. Tyler Barton is a writer, teacher, literary advocate, and author of Eternal Night at the Nature Museum and The Quiet Part Loud. He is also the artistic director of Writers and Books, Rochester's Literary Center. Please join me in welcoming Tyler to our podium.
Hi, everybody. And thank you, Susan, for that great introduction and for continuing to run this important program. I caught one of the last year's reviews on YouTube a couple of months ago, and it really helped us to celebrate Soil, which I saw a copy of here that Catherine's got, which we just named as the 2025 Rochester Reads selection, and Camille was here recently. So this program does a lot of good to expose people in Rochester to new books, so I'm happy to be a part of it. I'm speaking today about Bibliophobia by Sarah Chihawa, and I Yes, I recently moved here to Rochester. I'm pretty new. I moved here in February to start working at the at Writers and Books. So I'm still sort of getting to know the area and everything. This is actually my first time in this library, but I'm just happy to be here and to meet all of you. So I'm gonna kick us off here in a second. So, despite being my favorite thing in the world, books inspire fear in me in many ways. There are the books so good they scare me from ever writing again. There are books piling up beside my bed that taunt me for giving up on them, shaming me for not offering what I advocate for in so many other contexts, a second chance. Fear, too, that a book might ruin me, be so singular and edifying that I'd never find another book that released as many endorphins in my brain or meant as much to me, that there'd be some high point to my reading and everything else would pale and reading would die for me. There are books like Gulag Archipelago, House of Leaves, and Eileen that just plain terrify me. They're scary books. There are the books I've written, which I fear rereading sometimes, hearing the voice I had at 26 or 30. I'm 34 now, but at 30 I was a child, I know that. There are the books you always see languishing in little free libraries or dusty thrift shops by Bill O'Reilly or Glenn Beck that freak me out as I briefly imagine what they do to their readers' minds. And there's this hardcover I'm about to spend $30 on. I have to think to myself in line at the indie bookstore, what if it's bad? What if this is a waste of money? But I fear nothing more, and I believe Sarah Chihaya and I share this fear, than the books I haven't written. The ones I worked on for years, as well as the ones that quickly abandoned first drafts, the ones that never left my notes app on my phone or my dreams. I wasn't sure what Bibliophobia was going to be about when I opened it, but it begins in a mental hospital. In media res of the author's long-anticipated nervous breakdown. A depressive, books-obsessed child, Sarah Chihaya resisted the urge to accept what she long felt was a forthcoming nervous breakdown for most of her adult life, calling the very idea of a nervous breakdown something not for people like me, not for the children of immigrant parents. It was something that happened to white people in independent films or in middle-brow realist novels. And I'm stepping into the middle of her quote here to say, and here's where the book really hooked me as a writer and as a reader, a person who, too, has devoted my personal and professional life to the heralding of literature, because Chihaya can write beautifully, surprising, and cuttingly funny sentences. She goes on about breakdowns. Breakdown was what happened when their gorgeous shells became so brittle and delicate they could be shattered with the slightest tap of a spoon, tenderly set and ready to ooze out of their gelid whites with hot, vividly compelling golden violence. Breakdown is the final frontier of assimilation, she writes. Chihaya is, at this point in her life, in her mid-30s, an academic trying to finish a book that she's been toying with since her dissertation, a book she can't seem to work on, nonetheless finish, but if finished and published by a reputable academic press, could gain her the coveted safety of tenure. And on top of that, she'll have entered the literary landscape in some way by adding her name to the shelves that she spent her life pondering. But instead of tenure, Chihaya ends up with a nervous collapse. So that's how the book begins. Our first chapter is Chihaya sort of in the present, or closer to the present than most of the book, with her experience in a mental institution when she had a nervous breakdown. Bibliophobia is Chihaya's first book, a biography of her bookish life, chronicling each of her most formative experiences through the lens of the books she was reading at that time. But the book begins with a period unlike any in her life previously, when she could no longer read at all, had in fact developed an aversion and an inability to read so intense it can be accurately characterized as a phobia. Reader, she writes, after describing in tragicomic detail the neutral, nearly textless facility of the hospital she was in. It was the books that did it. Not only the ones piling up unread in her house, but the very literal fear of her overstuffed, unmoored bookshelves coming down on top of her, the way Leonard Bass dies in E.M. Forrester's Howard's End. Chihaya persuades the reader, well, in my opinion, that she was truly anxious about this entirely possible way to die, but she also wonders if, in reading Howard's End, that book planted the fear in her mind. I can't be sure what came to me first, the illusion or the fear itself. I wonder if without them being books, I'd have any thoughts at all, or if I'd be anyone at all. This is really the core of Chihaya's mental anguish. She has become fully identified with literature. Something I can relate to. I'm a bit have devoted my life to books, to writing, to promoting literature, to talking about books. My house is covered in books. Most of the walls are bookshelves. So books are everywhere. So I can relate to her in some of those. She's become fully identified by literature. I've only recently come to see that my relationship to books has become, or perhaps has always been, an uncomfortable but unnecessary vacillation between love and terror, between bibliophobia and bibliophilia, meaning the fear of books and the love of books. She'd spent over 30 years of her life believing that if she simply read enough and read the right stuff, one day the book would come to her that saved her life. 3 times before the age of 18, Chihaya confesses in the book's opening chapter, she had tried to end her life. The last page of that book would be the first page of my real life, she says, of the book that she always imagined would kind of save her from her mental disorder, her anxiety, and her depression. It is these 2 core beliefs that her story would either end in suicide or a book would save her life that gave Chihaya's pre-breakdown life structure, and it is those ideas she must learn to dispense with by revisiting her life's most formative titles. So, after she leaves the hospital, Chihaya, in a profound new place of being unable to read at all, decides that to fix this problem she will trace her reading roots, which is why this book, like none other I've encountered, opens directly after the table of contents with a list called Texts in Order of Appearance. So after the table of contents, then you have a new table of contents, which is basically throughout the book, here are all the texts I'm going to reference, their titles and authors, and this list goes on for 4 pages. She covers 50 different texts in this 300-page book. Some mentions for a sentence or 2, and others gives almost a full chapter to analyzing not only the book, but that book's impression on her life and what it taught her, as she does with Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, or with Ruth Ozeki's A Tale for the Time of Being. So, texts in order of appearance. 47 books and articles appear here, creating a kind of bibliographic list poem of the book's contents. Chihaya's tastes tend towards highbrow and canon-adjacent texts, but this list also includes the author of Anne of Green Gables, Tana French, Bjork, Joan Baez, and the American Psychiatric Association. Her reading DNA is a little ivory tower, but also tower records, popular fiction, and mental diagnostic texts. Reading was my whole life, she writes. Whether I liked it or not, my physical space was constructed by walls of books. All of them were useless to me now, and looking at them, I felt nauseous. It is in returning to the books of her youth, her pre-teenhood, her teenage years, and her campus dramas that she understands the mental and emotional patterns of herself and life over a series of chapters that serve as memoirs and critical essays on literature combined. Before she goes from this post-hospitalization period of non-reading back to her first loves, Anne of Green Gables, she writes, I was always reading for something, first for comfort, for pleasure, for validation, for comprehension, later for symptoms, for ideas, for citation, for tenure, and always secretly for salvation. But it is only since my period of non-reading that I am learning how to really read closely and deeply without expectations, either of the books I encounter or of myself. The opening of the book tracks her breakdown in the months immediately after, when she's struggling with her newfound inability to read. The final chapter finds her in the present, not only able to read and writing the book that you're reading, but equipped with a newfound understanding of herself as the author of her own story, as opposed to simply a character she's watching live through her life, or a critic judging that character herself, tragic flaws, sad mistakes, and depressive tendencies. I found the opening and final chapters of this book satisfying, interesting on a metaphysical level, pushing me to consider how much of myself, or how much of my sense of self, is bound up in my readership, my being a writer, and the life of my own imagination. I considered the books in my life that were important to me only in that they signaled to others what kind of person I wanted to be. Like when I pretended to be obsessed with The Way of a Pilgrim, because it is what Franny Glass is obsessed with in Franny and Zoe. If you remember that story at all, by J.D. Salinger, Franny's sort of obsessed with one bit of text from this book, and so there was a year that I bought that book and carried it around with me. I never read it, but I wanted people to know that this was who I wanted to be, like some kind of overly anxious Franny. But also Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse when I was trying to be a Buddhist, or as I called it, Buddhish. And, many records I've bought simply to say I have them, even though I don't listen to them. So it did make me consider, like, how, my own sort of, like, identifying maybe too much with books or putting too much weight on books to tell me and other people who I am. However, the bulk of the book, its middle 6 chapters, despite the fact that they mixed memoir and literary criticism in a way that reminded me really of only one other book from recent years, Claire Louise Bennett's Check Out 19. I found those chapters ultimately not as easy to sink into because I'd read almost none of the books that tentpole Chihaya's reading life, of Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye being a major exception. But many of the books she talks about I hadn't read, and I do want to credit Chihaya. She does an excellent job of summarizing each book she's talking about in a way that doesn't spoil the book, but also makes it sound interesting, and she connects it to her own life. But I was sort of lacking that personal connection that would make those texts really exciting to read about. Like, I hadn't read the Anne of Green Gables books or many of the other, like A.S. Byatt's Possession. On top of that, much of her memoirs, her lonely days reading as a child, her friendships in school, her breakups and her breakups lacked compelling narrative beats. Chihaya actually wrestles with this non-narrative structure to her own life and memories in the 2nd chapter, writing, I remember very few events from childhood, and the ones that remain are disjointed, often unrelated, and highly specific. But I do have many sensory memories of how the matter of the world felt and looked and smelled. I too feel this way about my own life, that the sensory details stick with me, but I am unable to see my events as connected to a single narrative. One of the annoying things I tell my friends, usually in some cranky way about, this is another quote from Chihaya. One of the annoying things I tell my friends, usually in some cranky way about exciting movies or TV shows they want me to watch, is that my brain doesn't move fast enough for action. I'm not so much interested in what happens as in how it's happening, and what happens all around the happening. She describes how this influences her reading tastes, feeling more drawn to vibey, navel-gazy books that are led by character and voice and idea than by compelling or twisting plots. But I have to say, even though I'm that kind of reader myself, I'm drawn to books that are maybe genreless or kind of others would see as plotless. I found some of Chihaya's chapters lacking those plot points that would make them feel more substantial. There's excellent literary critical insight, sentence after beautifully written sentence, but with the first chapter feeling so much like a charged story. We've got a character in the hospital. It seems that books have put her there. I was a little bit let down that most of the book didn't take place in the past, that most of the book took place in the past and in the pages of other books. I was kind of, I wanted to know about Chihaya's life right then when she was in the hospital. She spends most of the book going back. And it makes sense because she's trying to write a book here that is unlike other books. It's a memoir and it's multiple critical essays on literature in one. And it was something new to me. In the 2nd chapter, Canadian World, chronicling Chihaya's earliest reading obsessions, the most compelling, if tragic, moment of the book occurs. At 10, she swallows a bunch of Tylenol pills after getting a bad grade on a math test. This first suicide attempt is shocking to the reader, but it's moved past pretty quickly. What was satisfying about this chapter, however, was Chihaya's learning as she's researching her childhood obsession author, Lucy Maud Montgomery, that the writer of all those Anne of Green Gables books was also highly depressive and wrote detailed accounts of her plans to end her own life in her unpublished journals. On March 23, 1942, Montgomery, the author of 20 novels and over 500 short stories, wrote in her journal, "My life has been hell, hell, hell. My mind is gone. I Everything in the world I live for is gone. The world has gone mad. I shall be driven to end my life. Oh God, forgive me. Nobody dreams what my awful position is. The young Chiaya didn't know the author who inspired her to be not only an avid reader, but a writer herself, was someone who throughout her life struggled with a similar intense depression that the author of Bibliophobia does. A month after writing that journal entry, Montgomery overdosed on barbiturates and died. As a teenager, Chiaya, reading Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye, decides she will become a writer. In college, she becomes fixated, always searching for that book that will save her life, on A.S. Byatt's novel Obsession. In a further chapter, she suffers an intense breakup and pours a summer of her life into the poet Anne Carson's book-length work of verse, The Glass Essay. There is then a deep dive into Ruth Ozeki's 2013 A Tale for the Time of Being. Then it is Joan Baez's songbook and a collection of texts about mental health that led Chiaya to answers about her own lifelong struggles with her mind. Her bibliography is eclectic and boundless, and I respect her immensely for putting earnest and insightful discussions of lowbrow text in the same chapters, sometimes the same paragraphs, as masterpieces of classic literature such as The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, a text with which Chiaya devotes most of her teenage chapter of the book after she analyzes many works by Bjork. She's Canadian, so that kind of explains the Bjork obsession. But despite the floating feeling of the book's middle chapters, it is in her last chapter that closure comes. She talks about how the pressure to publish a book from her doctorate dissertation, a deeply researched work of comparative literature about an idea she calls de-narrative desire, in order to gain tenure, and that failure ultimately led to her breakdown. She writes, "The whole time I was planning, writing, and revising that unfinished book, I was still so certain that there was only one way for my story to end, eventually in suicide. My last chapter had always been pre-written. It was only long after the hospital, and after the slow realization that I had to let go of my stagnant, stubborn reading of the text of my own life to parse it clearly, that I saw how wildly irrational this belief was. Its foolishness and its cruelty was made clear to me in starkest relief by The Guardian, An Elegy for a Friend by Sarah Mangusa. This book doesn't save Chiaya's life in the way she always imagined a book could, by sort of curing her of depression, but by showing her how to be the author of her own life. I alternated between being someone who was forever at the mercy of plots I had no control over, and between being a character. Take that again. This is Chiaya. I alternated between being someone who was forever at the mercy of plots I had no control over, and being someone who believed they knew exactly how those plots worked. In other words, between being a character and being a critic. Nowhere had I taken responsibility for being my own author. It is after this realization that Chiaya is able to look back on her breakdown, to revisit in painful details the events and non-events of her life, and how they were spurred and understood by the book she was reading, that she began to write the book her readers hold, Bibliophobia. I think this book is commendable for how it cultivates an, if not new, then a rarely attempted genre of comparative literature autobiography. For anyone obsessed with reading or writing, it will give you many questions to wrestle with about identity in reading, and anyone whose depression has ever conjured the terrible idea of ending life, it will serve as an honest and substantive account of overcoming one's own death drive. It's a serious book, and not always as much fun as you might think, but it is a feat. And with the writing chops and emotional insight Chiaya displays in this, her hard-won first book, I truly hope there are more titles to come, maybe even some fiction, plot or not. So that's my little review. Thanks. I just wanted to add a few quotes that I felt related to this really well. One thing that Chiaya's book reminded me of tremendously was the writing of my favorite author, Mary Ruefle. She's a poet and essayist. She lives in Vermont. For the last 3 years, she was the Poet Laureate of Vermont. And she's just a wonderful writer. She has a book, Madness, Rack, and Honey, that I suggest to everyone. It's not poetry, it's essays or lectures on poetry, but they're really lectures on living life. And she has this great essay all about, the essay is called Someone Reading a Book is a Sign of Order in the World, and this is how that essay begins. When I was 45 years old, I woke up on an ordinary day, neither sunny nor overcast, in the middle of the year, and I could no longer read. It was the beginning of one of those marvelous sentences that only Nabokov can write. Mark felt a sort of delicious pity for the Frankfurters. In my vain attempt, I made out felt hat, pray, the city of Frankfurt, but the words that existed so I might read them sailed away, and I was stranded on a quay while everything I loved was leaving. And then it was I who was leaving. A terror seized me and took me up so high in its talons that I was looking down helplessly on a tiny, unrecognizable city, a city I had loved and lived in but would never see again. I needed reading glasses, but before I knew that, I was far, far away. Rueful's like intense fear there that she would never read again at the age of 45 because she suddenly can't make out the words on a page, or many of a different kind of bibliophobia or phobia around reading. And later in that essay, Mary Rueful also says, "Nothing I understand haunts me," and that's something that I felt that was that's like what I would choose as maybe a epigraph for Chihaya's book. Nothing I understand haunts me, because it's almost as if like at the point of beginning to write this book, she's still haunted in a sense by all these texts that have meant so much in her life, and she's not sure that she's ever fully understood what they've meant for her, why they were so important. So she's going back to try to understand them and maybe like release some of that terrible power that they have. Yeah, and then one other thing I just wanted to add too was like, I think there is also something in this book to be said for a different kind of phobia, which is called athazagoraphobia. And I haven't written about this enough because I've just kind of learned about it, but athazagoraphobia is known as the fear of being forgotten, or the fear of being left out or being ignored. And I do think that is an impulse that, though she doesn't talk about it directly, she keeps saying, my failure to write this book really precipitated my breakdown, and it's because I wanted to gain tenure. But I know from knowing so many writers and being a writer myself that this kind of like anxiety or fear about, what if I never publish my book? What if my name is never on the spine on those shelves that I've always admired? This kind of like, it is related to this maybe deeper fear of being forgotten, being left out, having spent your life engaged with literature, but then you're if you don't write a book, if you don't add to the canon in some way, are you going to be remembered? So I thought maybe she was kind of wrestling with those feelings as well, or maybe that's just my own psyche that was coming into the text. But so those are just some end notes. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. Does anyone have any questions about